Well, welcome everyone. What a great day Metadata has put on for us all. I hope you've enjoyed yourself thus far. My name is Lori Nahabedian. I'm the Senior Manager of Database Programming at PROMETRIKA.
And I'm Kathy Hultz, Director of Data Management at PROMETRIKA.
And PROMETRIKA is a full-service global CRO, and in 2023 we are celebrating our 20th anniversary. We've been a metadata partner for 10 years, and we're accredited in 4 metadata products: Rave Coder, RTSM, TSDV, and Patient Cloud. So we're here today to talk about rescue studies. And a rescue study can mean many different things. For the purposes of today's discussion, a rescue study means moving a Rave study from one metadata URL to another. PROMETRIKA, and why do you move a study? Well, we've actually run into 3 scenarios on why we would move a study. One is the study was bought out. One is the sponsor was acquired. And the other one is, unfortunately, sometimes there's a strange CRO relationship that requires that move. So what are the challenges of... Let's see, the notes aren't right. Mm-hmm. What are the challenges of rescuing a study? First and foremost, what we see is high anxiety and stress on the sponsor side. How do we do it? Can it be done? How long will it take? What is the impact to my study and my study data? Rest assured, rescuing a study is absolutely possible and achievable by leveraging the tools already available to us on the metadata platform. I personally have built studies on 4 different EDC platforms, and Rave is the only platform that gives me the tools in order to do a study move. Other issues are amount of data, study timeline, and study downtime. So all of those 3 things play in together. If you're rescuing a study that's just in development, there is no production data, so the transfer or the move of that study is pretty straightforward and quick. If you have a study in production, it's a phase 1 study, say, small amount of patients, small amount of data, you're going to be able to move that study data a whole lot quicker than a phase 3 trial with, thousands of patients and tens of thousands of study data. So those 3 factors play big into how long it will take to move your study. And lastly, sometimes when you're in the situation of a CRO, a strained CRO relationship, getting the documentation you need in order to achieve that study move can be problematic at times. So today we're going to refer back to a case study. It was a rare oncology phase 1 study. It was a dose escalation expansion study, so fairly complicated. It existed on a sponsor URL. Study was acquired. We needed to move it to another sponsor URL, and they wanted this move to happen within 8 weeks. So just like any project, collaboration is key to executing a successful study move. And there are many players involved. We have the 2 sponsors. They're necessary for setting the intention for the study move and describing sort of the timelines in which, their tolerance for study downtime, and helping us to procure the documents that we need in order to facilitate that study move. At PROMETRIKA, you're going to get 3 key team members. There'll be other people behind the scenes, but your 3 key team members are your project manager, your data manager, and your database programmer. The project manager deals with all the communication between all the parties, issue escalation, and of course, timeline management. It is your data manager and your database programmer who actually plan your study move, execute that study move, validate it, and then document the entire study move process. So we have that in our back pocket. So PROMETRIKA data managers and database programmers work with the DMCRO. They're critical in getting us the documentation and the files necessary to make the move. Without that, there would be no move. The clinical CRO is important for site communication, setting expectations for study downtime, and working with the sites and the CRAs on the data quality before that study is shut down on the original URL. We have to work with external vendors to understand if there's an integration, what their integration needs are. And then lastly, the metadata PM for provisioning the URL, making medical dictionaries available to the URL, or any other metadata modules. So at PROMETRIKA, we have a 5-stage process. Each piece of the process feeds into the next. It's very sequential. You can't just jump to production. You have to go through all of these phases in order to move a study. We start out this process with a kickoff meeting with all the players involved at the table. We discuss expectations, timelines, risks in each phase of this process, which we will go over to make sure everyone is on board and what is needed to execute the study move. The most important part of this process is planning. You have to have good planning. Good planning gives good outcome. So within the analysis phase, there's actually two-pronged. There's a technical analysis and there's a data analysis. And they can happen in parallel in this particular phase. For the technical analysis, we take a look at 3 critical documents to begin with. One is the protocol, of course, the core configuration, which describes the environment under which the study was built, and then the architect loader specification, which is the actual study build itself. We do a deep dive into those 3 documents to tease out all of the components that we can find that are necessary to configure a URL and to configure a study on that URL. In our case study, what we found, it was a fairly simplistic as far as it wasn't using a whole bunch of extra Rave modules, but we did find it was using local labs. So that told us we needed to configure local labs on the new URL, and we had to get a lab loader file from the DM CRO to upload those local lab files that are already in use on that new URL. It also told us, let me see, synonym lists. They were using Coder. So we had to actually, we saw that they were using Coder, so that told us part of our move process was we had to configure Coder on the URL. We had to get the synonym list from the existing URL over so that we could upload those on the new URL, so we wouldn't lose any of that work. And then more simplistically, we saw that they were using email alerts, and the email alerts use email strings and email distribution lists based upon, the sponsors. So we knew that we would have to get new email addresses for the new sponsor where this URL was going. So external data integrations. This particular study didn't have a whole bunch of external data integrations. They weren't using an IWRS. There was nobody that was putting data into the study database, the EDC database, but we think it's important to just say that this is a component you have to look at. We've done it, we've had external data integrations with other study rescues. So you always have to get the data transfer specification from that vendor, and it has to be reworked for the new URL. We have to do a Rave Web Services configuration. This is the bridge that allows an external system to talk to the Rave EDC. So we need to understand how to build that bridge so that external data can transfer between the two. And then, of course, we always will do a full UAT of any data integration that is necessary.
As Laurie said, that we didn't really have any external data to integrate in this study, but something that you do have to consider is subjects and the data. So if it was integrated, the subjects were created by an external RTSM, and they created them. Were they going to recreate, or were we going to start entry, and then they would push the new subjects through? And the same goes for any data, like any ePro data that may have been in there. Were they just going to re-push it all? Or were they going to do a partial push and we would enter the data that was there? Those are considerations that need to be thought of. And we even needed to, when we went to re-enter the data, was how were those subjects going to be recreated in prod? Because, the sites created them. But it's definitely something that needs to be considered if you have any external data integration in your studies.
So for our case study, even though they didn't have any direct integration to the EDC, they did have a central lab that they were dealing with. So we could see that there was a central lab in the protocol. We looked into the ALS. We saw there was no data being put in there. So we knew we still needed to have a data transfer specification set up with that external vendor in order to pull that data over for as an external file. And then we did see that they were integrating with an external data analytics vendor. So we knew, once we saw that there was going to be a Rave Web Services integration set up for that vendor.
So just as Laurie had said that she did a technical analysis, we, on the data side, did it, just go up one. Ooh, no, forward.
This is back.
Keep, green one.
Green.
Yeah, keep going. Keep going. One more. Okay, so we did a data analysis of the data, current data. So we looked at how many subjects, number of forms total, number of queries that were either open and answered and then canceled and closed. And then we looked at the number of forms by looking at how many were SDV'd, how many were DM reviewed and signed. So we needed to consider all of that. So in this analysis, that's what helped us determine, were we going to batch upload this data or were we going to re-enter it? So by reassessing all of this, we made the determination that we were going to re-enter the data. Plus, the sponsor was on for that because of the timing. We had the resources available to handle the entry, and then based on the amount of data and the timing. So for this case study, there were 17 subjects, over 1,500 forms. So that really solidified the entry, but that was key to making that determination that it was better to re-enter the data.
So once we finished our analysis, it was time to do planning. How are we actually going to execute, make this move happen, both from a technical side and from a data side? So again, this is a two-pronged approach. They can happen in parallel. From the technical side, we write a study configuration plan. This is a plan that talks about the new environment, what are the components of that new environment, how is that going to unfold on that new URL, what are the documents needed for that environment, any risk assessments, whether any documentation needs to be updated. There's just a whole lot that goes into that. One of the biggest pieces of this process is developing the study configuration checklist. And this is an actual step-by-step, very methodical approach to how to reconfigure that URL and configure that study on that URL. For instance, if you know you need local labs, you can't just upload your local lab file. The sites need to exist first. So that order matters in order to create that study over there.
So after Laurie's team kind of had the reconfiguration of the study on the new URL, we had to develop a reconfiguration UAT plan because we did do a reconfiguration. So we created a plan that contained our testing approach. It contained the requirements, the test plan, the risk assessment. We did go with a risk-based UAT, and the UAT consisted of, we moved the prod sites into UAT and recreated all the prod subjects again, just to make sure that there were no duplicates, that they were coming in sequentially, because we were adding them through custom functions. So we UAT'd the matrix, we looked at lab ranges, we did the email alerts again, we made sure CODA was working again, we looked at all derivations, we re-UAT'd all the derivations again. We had a separate role that we needed to make sure that those forms were still being able to be entered by this role, so we switched to this role. We did for the edit checks, we took all the safety and efficacy forms and re-UAT'd those edit checks for those forms. So, and then we followed our UAT SOPs process for this re-UAT, and we documented it in all our issues, reporting and tracking, and then we produced a summary report once we were all done. And there were no findings, there shouldn't have been any findings, because we just were retesting that entire system that we had built on the old URL and did all the prior UAT and retested it again on just a new URL, and it worked still. So another plan, there's a lot of planning in this. There was a lot of plans. So this is our study data plan. So this was our plan on how we were going to re-enter that data into the new study on the new URL. So we had all of these steps in there. You can go to the next slide. One of the major key components in the data plan was the data entry guidelines. We had to create new data. We created data re-entry guidelines. In the plan, we outlined who the team would be. They were trained on the re-entry guidelines. We assigned sites and subjects. We had re-entry trackers. We had data issue trackers. And then we had a setup for how we were going to handle the queries that would generate after the data was entered. So that plan, the data entry guidelines included things like enter exactly what you see. So they used the visual verification of the old screens and entered the data from there. They also had access to the PDFs. But we had, at the end of the day, that databases were supposed to be exactly alike. There was no differences at all. So that was the plan, and that's why the entry guidelines were so very specific. We had to enter like an AE, and if it had been inactivated, we entered it and then inactivated it. We did the same process for forms and visits. We entered them and then inactivated them. So when you think about it, when the sites go to start working again on the new URL, they needed to know that row 2 of their AE had been previously deleted and could still see it because we could probably reference it in a query somewhere down the road. So, all right.
Okay.
Let's go.
So once we've confirmed the URL is set up, then we just take that study configuration checklist and we just start going step by step through the process. And that checklist has what the steps are, who's responsible for that checklist, what documents or files are feeding into that step, the verification of that step, and a verification is done by an independent database programmer, and then the results of that verification. On this particular case study, we were able to configure the study in like 35 steps. So pretty impressive, I think. So once the configuration was done, we make sure that on the previous URL, all users are set to read only so that they can't enter data, verify data, or do anything on that new URL, that old URL.
So here's the data entry, execution, and verification. So we executed the study plan. We executed those data entry guidelines on the clinical data. We entered just per the guidelines, like I said, enter leading zeros, don't enter leading zeros. Inactivate log, entered AEs, and then inactivate them. So we entered the data. Then the lead DM had gone in and addressed all the queries because the queries would fire. So we had to address those and leave ones open and close ones that had been previously addressed. And that was a whole other process. Then once all the data was entered and the queries were addressed, we ran SAS proc compares by subject. So we took the old SAS data from the old URL study and compared it to the new SAS data sets. And so our statistical programming team created the programs and we just compared them one by one, each subject one at a time. And it picked up errors like spacing. It picked up if we corrected a spelling, and we weren't supposed to. If we corrected the spelling just intuitively, we had to go back and put it back wrong. So it picked up little subtle things like that. And one thing that we learned is all the metadata fields, first we didn't realize. We ran the proc, and I was like, oh my gosh, look at all this output. And I ran down to her and I said, what's happening? And she said, look, you have all the fields. We accounted for the metadata fieldoids in there, all those numbers. And of course they were going to be different and we didn't realize, so we had to redo the program to remove those fields. And that was all clearly documented in our plan to say what had happened because it technically failed and then we re-executed it. But then it was seamless and flawless.
So now the study is up and running on the URL. All of the production data has been entered, so the next step is to actually go live. So it was the simplest step of all. We received a user export from the original URL and uploaded it to the new URL. All the users were live, and we were done. It was pretty cool. Also the production users from the original URL needed to be removed. Otherwise, this study would show up on the user's iMetadata homepage twice. So they needed to go back and remove those folks. And then the original URL owners needed to work with metadata to either have the study or the URL in the study decommissioned from their URL. So the rescue result was good news. New URL and the medical dictionaries were provisioned by metadata in 10 days. We had that study up and running, configured on the new URL in 4 days. The UAT of that new study was done within 5 days. All data was entered and validated in 7 days, and we had that study configured up and running in less than 6 weeks. So I hope you realize, though the need or the want to move a URL, a study from one URL to another may seem daunting, it's completely doable using the tools provided by metadata.